Good morning and welcome to Iron Sharpens Iron. I am Jeremy Nettles. I am the evangelist for the River Ridge Church of Christ that meets in Newburgh, Indiana. If you'd like to get in touch with me, you can give me a call or a text at 812-550-6234, and you can also send an email to info@riverridgechurch.org. What I want to talk about with you this morning is a symbol. I want to talk about the cross. Now, the cross is a symbol that is very important to a lot of different people, and there are some different reasons for its importance. The cross has taken on many forms, and a special significance is attached to a lot of these different visual forms. Now, I think it's worthwhile to go through some of these examples. And so, for example, if you take a look at this picture here, this is what's called a Latin cross. It's particularly associated with the Romans and the way that they constructed them. And you'll see this very, very often as a crucifix. That's just a Latin word. It's a compound, and it's the idea of something having been, fixed onto the cross. And in this case, of course, it is the body of Jesus. And this is probably the most recognizable form, either the Latin cross or the crucifix. And it's the most used, and there's a lot of reason for that, and there's certainly some meaning behind both of these. But they're not the only ones. There's also the Celtic cross, which has this interesting circle around it. I believe that's intended to represent sort of a halo in the way that a lot of medieval artwork, particularly Christian artwork, represented things. This is also very similar to the Coptic cross, which has a lot in common with that Celtic cross and is probably for the same reason, but it also calls back to a much, much older symbol that is very pre-Christian, even pre-Judaism. These two are the next most used, and I'm kind of lumping them together because they're so similar. And I would say that probably the most common way that they are used is in gravestones. At least that's the way that I've seen them the most. But again, there are other forms. There's what's called the Tau cross. Now, Tau is a Greek letter. It's the same as our T, and it's formed like a capital T. And the difference between this and the Latin cross, of course, is that in the Latin cross, there was a part of the vertical beam that went up above, and with the Tau cross, there isn't one. And then there's also the form that is sometimes called the Greek cross, which is, to us, it kind of just looks like a plus symbol. But while these are both less well known, they are still seen in a lot of the artwork, and they were actually forms that were used when people were executing criminals by crucifixion. There are also a couple of different crosses that are associated with particular people. There is what's often called the St. Andrew's cross, which is X-shaped, and then there is what's sometimes called St. Peter's cross, which is the same as the Latin cross, except it's kind of upside down. Now, both of these have been kind of distorted in recent years. I won't go into the St. Andrew's cross, but the St. Peter's cross has been associated with a sort of anti-Christian attitude, somewhat ironically. A lot of atheists have looked at that and seen that it's an inverted cross and have assumed that it signifies the inversion of Christ's message. But originally, it stood for humility. The idea was that Peter, when he was to be crucified, that he specifically requested to be crucified upside down because he didn't think that he was worthy to die in the same way that his Lord had died. Even over the last few centuries, while it has perhaps fallen out of favor in the public view, it's actually become a standard inclusion in some of the most important symbolism that most peoples engage in, and that would be the symbols that they place on their nation's flags. Now, the crosses that you see on flags aren't always intended to reflect the cross of Christ. There are some other reasons for it, but quite frequently that's what's going on. And so I'll show you two examples from today's flags. One of them is the Greek flag, and you can see, appropriately enough, a Greek cross up there in the left corner of it. And here's another one that's probably a little bit more recognizable to most of you. It's the Union Jack, the flag of the United Kingdom. And this thing is covered with crosses. It has a Greek cross where the upper portion of the vertical beam is the same length as the lower portion, and that is because of England's association with St. George and St. George's association with that style of cross. And then there's also the X-shaped one, the St. Andrew's cross, because of Scotland's association with St. Andrew. And by the way, there's another X-shaped one for St. Patrick that's a little bit less noticeable there, because Ireland is a part of the United Kingdom. Sometimes the symbol of the cross is grossly misused, as you can see happening here. I don't even know exactly what the KKK is intending to symbolize by its use of the cross, let alone burning it. Frankly, I'm not that interested. I mostly just find it despicable and abhorrent that such a disgusting, hateful ideology is being associated in any way at all with Jesus. But there are also uses of the cross where the goals are far more noble. Have you ever seen this, for example? This gigantic monstrosity sits along the interstate where I-57 and I-70 are parallel to each other in Illinois around Effingham. This thing is 198 feet tall. It required 180 tons of steel to build. That makes it, by a long shot, the largest cross in the world. And it was intended, and this is straight from the proprietors here, to provide a statement of faith and a beacon of hope to 50,000 passing motorists each day. Well, living over here in the Evansville area, you probably won't see that very often, but you might see crosses like these on a regular basis. These little pendants whose owners are intending to convey some sense of faith and devotion through the symbol that they carry around on their neck or on their wrist or on their ankle. The cross is an important symbol to a lot of people, and it's even become important as a part of the English language. This has been the case since at least the 1500s, as far as I've been able to discover. But where did this all come from? Why is the cross so important? Where did the symbolism begin? Was it in the letters of Paul? Well, it certainly shows up there, but Paul didn't start it. Did it begin in the early church even before Paul was a Christian? Well, it's there too, but again, that was not where it started. Well, you would think, obviously, it's about Christ's death. And yes, that's why it has become as important as it is, but it didn't actually start there. Jesus talks about it during his ministry. Let's examine this by opening up our Bibles to Luke chapter 9. In Luke chapter 9, let's read verses 18 through 25. Now it happened that as he was praying alone, the disciples were with him, and he asked them, "Who do the crowds say that I am?" And they answered, "John the Baptist, but others say Elijah, and others that one of the prophets of old has risen." Then he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" And Peter answered, "The Christ of God." And he strictly commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, "The Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised." And he said to all, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. For what does it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits himself?" Now some try to do literally what Jesus has told them to do here, take up your cross daily with the sort of pendants that we saw a moment ago. Others see it as being more symbolic for whatever burdens that they have in life. You might hear people saying things like, "Well, that's my cross to bear." It's something that they have to live with every day of their lives. And so we can see how the cross was and is an important symbol to many people of faith and devotion in the world today. It wasn't quite like that for the apostles. Now, we can't see how they may have used it pictorially, but we can read about the cross and its symbolic nature in the letters that the apostles wrote. Now, the first way that they use it is not quite the same as what we have seen already, but it is similar. They use it as a symbol of salvation. And so, for example, in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, Paul talks about the cross as a symbol, and he says in 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verses 17 and 18, "For Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel, and not with words of eloquent wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. For the word of the cross is folly to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God." The power of the cross is our salvation from sin. So that's the first way that it's being used, as a symbol of God's power and a symbol of salvation. The second way is completely different, And in order for us to really understand it, it's going to require a background study that's going to take us eventually back to the Old Testament as well. But before we do that, let's start in Galatians chapter 5. Galatians chapter 5, verse 11. Paul here says, "But if I, brothers, still preach circumcision, why am I still being persecuted? In that case, the offense of the cross has been removed." Now, he's trying to argue something about Jew and Gentile and whether you need to become a Jew before you become a Christian. But the really important thing there is that he says, if that were the case, then the offense of the cross has been removed. Well, that's an awfully strange thing to say. What is the offense of the cross? He just talked about it in 1 Corinthians as a great symbol of power, and now he says that it is offensive. Well, the author of Hebrews gives us a little bit of a clue in Hebrews chapter 12, verse 2. Picking up in the middle of the sentence, but the author says that we ought to look to Jesus, who is the founder and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is seated at the right hand of the throne of God. So Paul mentioned the offense of the cross, and now the author of Hebrews is mentioning shame that is associated with the cross. Now, what does that mean? What is the offense of the cross? What shame did Jesus despise for our sake? Well, Peter gives us a little bit of a hint back at the beginnings of the church in Acts chapter 5. Acts chapter 5, verse 30. Here Peter is giving a sermon to the Jewish council. And he says, "The God of our fathers raised Jesus, whom you killed by hanging him on a tree." Okay, now you might be confused. I just said that Peter was going to give us a hint as to the shame and the offense of the cross. And all we've got is Peter saying something strange about Jesus being hanged on a tree. Well, Peter repeats himself in another sermon in chapter 10 where he's talking to Cornelius and his household. And then Paul uses the same terminology again when he is addressing a synagogue full of Jews in Antioch of Pisidia. We can also see Peter using it again in his first letter. In 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 24, he says, "He himself bore our sins in his body on the tree, that we might die to sin and live to righteousness. By his wounds you have been healed." So we've got all these cases where Paul and Peter are talking about Jesus being killed on a tree. Tree? What tree? I thought Jesus was crucified. Was it a cross or was it a tree? And was he hanged, as Peter has said, being hanged on a tree, or was he nailed up there? Because the way that it was described in the Gospels was that he was nailed to the cross. Well, we've definitely established a pattern, and that should be enough for us to figure out through some study what's going on. But Paul's actually going to save us the effort and explain exactly why the apostles are calling the cross a tree instead. In Galatians chapter 3, he makes this abundantly clear to us. Galatians chapter 3, verse 13. "Christ redeemed us from the curse of the law by becoming a curse for us. For it is written, 'Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree.'" So now Paul is saying that Jesus became a curse by taking this curse upon himself. And what was the curse? "Cursed is everyone who is hanged on a tree." Well, now it makes a little bit more sense. We might not know exactly why they're referring to the cross as a tree, but it is being connected to an obscure law in the law of Moses. Now we can find this law in Deuteronomy chapter 21, verses 22 and 23. "And if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree, his body shall not remain all night on the tree, but you shall bury him the same day, for a hanged man is cursed by God. You shall not defile your land that the Lord your God is giving you for an inheritance." That's that curse that Paul was just talking about. Everyone who is hanged from a tree is cursed by God. Now, obviously, a cross and a tree are not exactly the same thing, and nailing someone into these beams of wood is not quite the same thing as hanging someone from a tree, but the apostles are connecting the two because they have the same purpose. Let's think about this. In the case of this obscure law, this person was not put to death by hanging. This person was put to death and then hanged on a tree. Verse 22, and if a man has committed a crime punishable by death, and he is put to death, and you hang him on a tree. That's not talking about the method of execution. That's talking about something that might take place after the execution. Well, now, why should that happen? Why would anybody do that? That seems awfully bizarre. And then why would the dead man be cursed? I mean, he's already dead. What more can be done to him? Well, this is a practice that's actually been in use throughout the world for most of history. I'm very grateful that it's not in use anymore, but gibbeting was used historically for a very, very long time all over the world. Let's look at a couple of examples in the Old Testament as to how this is put into practice and why. In Joshua chapter 8, verses 28 and 29, so Joshua burned Ai and made it forever a heap of ruins as it is to this day, and he hanged the king of Ai on a tree until evening. And at sunset Joshua commanded, and they took his body down from the tree and threw it at the entrance of the gate of the city and raised over it a great heap of stones which stands there to this day. So this spurned Canaanite king, who has been judged by God's people as they go in and conquer the land that God has promised to them, his body is hanged on the tree, and then in accordance with the law, Joshua says, take him down, and they bury him. Let's look at another example in 2 Samuel chapter 4. Now, before we get into reading this time, I think it's worth prefacing what has happened here is that Saul and Jonathan have been killed in battle, and Saul's remaining son Ishbosheth has been made king over Israel. David had been made king over Judah already. And two men named Rechab and Baanah murder Ishbosheth, and they think that David will be pleased by what they have done. And so they go to report this to David. And we pick up in 2 Samuel 4, verses 9 through 12. But David answered Rechab and Baanah, his brother, the sons of Rimmon the Beerothite, as the Lord lives, who has redeemed my life out of every adversity, when one told me, behold, Saul is dead, and thought he was bringing good news, I seized him and killed him at Ziklag, which was the reward I gave him for his news. How much more, when wicked men have killed a righteous man in his own house on his bed, shall I not now require his blood at your hand and destroy you from the earth? And David commanded his young men, and they killed them and cut off their hands and feet and hanged them beside the pool at Hebron. But they took the head of Ishbosheth and buried it in the tomb of Abner at Hebron. Now, it's unclear in this case whether them means the hands and feet or the bodies, but it's probably just the hands and feet. It's not an exact analogy, but it's something very similar that's going on here. The bodies, or at least the parts of the bodies, are being put on display as a spectacle to cause further shame even after these people's death. It's the way of dealing with the worst of offenders. There's one more example that I think is worth thinking about. Esther. Now, if you don't remember what happens in the book of Esther, the Jewish nation is in peril because there's a horrible man named Haman who wants to commit a genocide, and he has it particularly out for the Jews, and particularly for one Jew named Mordecai. And he sets up a gallows in his own home, which is reserved for Mordecai. And it should be noted in the case of the Persian gallows, it's not quite what you would be expecting. It's more about impaling than suspending a body on a rope. But regardless of all of that, what ends up happening is that Haman is impaled on his own gallows. But you might not remember what happens to Haman's sons. So let's turn to Esther chapter 9 and read about that. Verses 11 through 14. That very day the number of those killed in Susa the citadel was reported to the king, and the king said to Queen Esther, in Susa the citadel the Jews have killed and destroyed 500 men, and also the 10 sons of Haman. What then have they done in the rest of the king's provinces? Now, what is your wish? It shall be granted you. And what further is your request? It shall be fulfilled. And Esther said, if it please the king, let the Jews who are in Susa be allowed tomorrow also to do according to this day's edict, and let the 10 sons of Haman be hanged on the gallows. So the king commanded this to be done. A decree was issued in Susa, and the 10 sons of Haman were hanged. So again, what we've got happening here is that not only have the 10 sons of Haman already been killed, but their corpses are being hanged. They are being displayed as a way to further shame them, and most importantly, to provide an example for others. That's what's really at play here. What can you do to somebody after they're already dead? Well, the last insult that you can give is to hang up their corpse to put it on display. It's the ultimate expression of utter disdain. And God says that because of that, such a man is cursed. And he also imposes a limit upon how far his people were allowed to do that. Now, leaving the corpses to decay was actually seen as optional by some, and the law of Moses strictly prohibited that. But there was a similar Roman purpose in crucifixion. Typically, the bodies of those crucified would be left on display, left to rot, for passers-by to see and to gawk at, and to think, I don't want to end up like that. So we've now seen the cross as a symbol of faith, of devotion, of salvation, and of shame and derision and disdain. To complete the puzzle, we need to look at Jesus' use of the cross as a symbol. We started in Luke chapter 9, and so let's go back there and pick up where we left off. Luke chapter 9, verse 23. And he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross daily and follow me. Now he adds to this a little bit later in chapter 14, verse 27. Whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. Now, most people interpret these both as references to Christ's own coming execution, the fact that he was to be killed on a cross, or else they will look at it as an exhortation to bear burdens and hardships in life with Christ's help, and that goes back to that expression, my cross to bear. Some people would look at it as simply a requirement that we should be willing to face execution for our faith in Christ. But while those are all proper and those are all biblical ideas, they're not quite what Christ was talking about here in Luke 9 and Luke 14. Now, you might well wonder, how does he know this? Okay, let's keep looking in Luke chapter 23. As we follow the narrative here and we look at Jesus himself, he has said, if you won't carry your own cross, then you cannot be my disciple. Well, in Luke 23, verse 26, as they led him away, they seized one Simon of Cyrene, who was coming in from the country, and laid on him the cross to carry it behind Jesus. Is Jesus asking us to do something that he couldn't do himself? That would be uncharacteristic. Now, we know from John's gospel that Jesus actually did carry his own cross at some point, but he apparently was unable to continue, which is not a surprise considering the physical shape that he would have been in by that point, and so that burden was relinquished to this Simon. There's a tradition that he fell beneath the cross, and that's no more than tradition. It's not mentioned in the Bible, but it's a reasonable assumption based on the evidence before us. Regardless, it's pretty uncharacteristic for Jesus to require something of us that he was incapable of doing. So then what does he mean? As we go back to Luke 9, let's read verses 21 through 24 again. And he strictly charged and commanded them to tell this to no one, saying, the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and chief priests and scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And he said to all, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross daily, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will save it. Notice in all of that, he didn't tell them how he would die. They don't know that yet. So if he just means carry your load, then why didn't he do that himself when the time came? And if he means you should be willing to die in the same way that I'm going to, then why doesn't he make that clear to them in that moment? Because they don't know what's going to happen. He says that he's going to be rejected and killed and rise on the third day, but he doesn't mention crucifixion. How would they know? It's also worth noting that he said to do this daily. Well, that's kind of impossible if he just meant that we should all die for him. How can you do that daily? Now, you could make a case that he means you should be willing to die and that you should start every day willing to go to your death for Jesus' sake. And that's true. It's just not quite what he means. Because again, his audience does not know that he's going to be crucified yet. But they do know crucifixion. They had seen condemned men taking up their own crosses and carrying them out of the city to their own execution. Crucifixion was deliberately made as a public spectacle. They had seen the bodies of Gentiles decaying on crosses long after their deaths. They had seen the bodies of Jews being removed before nightfall, at least when the Romans allowed them to do that, in order to abide by the law of Moses. This, not Jesus' own experience with the cross, is the center of his teaching to his disciples in this instance. Now, we have the advantage of already knowing about Christ's crucifixion when we read these passages. But we should also try to understand Jesus in the way that his original audience did. Remove the stigma of the cross, all of its later symbolic meanings, and just hear the words of Christ as he spoke them. And we might well think about it in this way. If you imagine that noose hanging were Rome's preferred method of execution, then instead of saying, take up your cross daily, he would have said something like, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and put his noose around his neck daily and follow me. He's telling them, and he's telling you, to willingly pick up a shameful instrument of your own death and to calmly carry that to the place of your execution every day of your life. This is what Paul means in Galatians 6:14 when he says, "Far be it from me to boast, except in the cross of our Lord Jesus Christ, by which the world has been crucified to me, and I to the world." Now, he doesn't mean that in a literal sense. He hadn't been crucified, and in fact, he wouldn't. As a Roman citizen, when he was executed, he was beheaded instead, because that was more humane. But he means that in a symbolic way, for all intents and purposes, he has been put up on display and made a laughingstock and derided and shamed, and that the whole world has been put in that same position as far as he is concerned. This kind of an attitude will manifest itself in our daily lives. If we're actually doing this, then we're not going to be making choices that serve our own interests, but choices that serve Christ's. Give up your life. Trying to hold on to it means losing it in the end. Instead, if you will give your life to Christ, then in the end it will be saved. Live for Christ. After all, he lives for you. Well, I hope this has been worthwhile for you, this look at the cross and its symbolism and the way that it's used and what it means for us today is meaningful for me, and I hope that it is for you too. Thanks again for spending this time with me. I am Jeremy Nettles, and this has been Iron Sharpens Iron.